Captain Juan Pajota. The Great Raid at Cabanatuan. 1,000 Japanese soldiers stood between 500 dying prisoners and freedom, but they didn't count on a bridge rigged for hell and 200 guerrillas ready to claim their revenge.
The Bridge of Fire, Captain Pajota's impossible stand. The night of January 30th, 1945, was thick with the scent of ripening rice and the humid weight of the Philippine jungle. At exactly 1940 hours, the silence near the Kabul River was shattered, not by the sounds of nature, but by the rhythmic, mechanical roar of an American P-61 Black Widow night fighter. It buzzed the Cabanatuan prisoner of war camp, performing reckless aerobatics to keep the Japanese guards' eyes fixed on the sky. Beneath that distraction, 121 American Rangers were crawling through the dirt, inches away from a rescue that would become legend. But the success of the Great Raid did not rest solely on the Rangers. It rested on a wooden bridge 800 yards to the northeast, and on the shoulders of a man the history books too often overlook, Captain Juan Pajota. The mathematics of death. Pajota was a veteran of the resistance, a man who had traded his youth for a 3-year shadow war against the Japanese occupation. As he crouched behind the timber supports of the Kabul River Bridge, he looked across the water at a terrifying reality. On the far bank, 1,000 Japanese soldiers, a full battalion of reinforced infantry, were settling into their evening routines. They had tanks, heavy mortars, and trucks. Behind Pajota stood 200 Filipino guerrillas. The math was simple and brutal, they were outnumbered 5-1. If those 1,000 soldiers crossed the bridge, they would swarm the rescue operation, and every ranger and every emaciated prisoner would be slaughtered in the open fields. Pajota knew his enemy's psychology. He knew they expected the inferior local forces to harass and flee. He decided to use their own arrogance as a noose. He rigged the bridge with explosives, buried 25 landmines in the dirt of the approach, and positioned his men in a lethal V-shaped formation. He wasn't just planning to delay the Japanese, he was planning to annihilate them. The ghosts of Bataan. To understand why Pajota's men fought with such ferocity, one must look at the men they were trying to save. Inside the Cabanatuan camp were the survivors of the Bataan Death March. Men like Sergeant James Baldassari had been living in a waking nightmare since 1942. The camp was a factory of despair. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant Colonel Shigeji Mori, viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Under his watch, prisoners were fed starvation rations, maggot-ridden rice and rotten vegetables. By the end of 1942, over 2,600 Americans had already died there from dysentery, malaria, and terminal despair. By late 1944, the 511-odd survivors were skin and bone, most weighing less than 90 pounds. They had been told for years that America had forgotten them. They didn't know that the Palawan massacre, where Japanese guards burned 150 prisoners alive in trenches, had sparked a desperate race against time. General Walter Kruger of the 6th Army knew that as American forces closed in, the Japanese kill-all policy would be enacted. Cabanatuan had to be liberated now, or it would become a graveyard. The infiltration. The mission was a tactical nightmare. The Rangers, led by the meticulous Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci and Captain Robert Prince, had to travel 30 miles behind enemy lines. They moved like ghosts through Japanese-controlled territory, guided by Pajota's scouts. Local villagers risked execution to muzzle their dogs and pen their chickens, ensuring the massive American column could pass in absolute silence. On the afternoon of the 30th, the Rangers reached the final stretch. They spent 6 agonizing hours crawling 800 yards through open rice paddies, hiding in irrigation ditches every time a Japanese convoy rattled past on the main highway. Meanwhile, the Alamo Scouts, the elite of the elite, disguised themselves as local farmers. Wearing straw hats and carrying rusted tools, they walked right up to a shack near the camp gates. From there, they sketched the guard towers and located a shed housing 4 Japanese tanks. This intelligence was funneled back to Prince, who finalized the assault. F Company would hit the front gate, and C Company would storm the prisoner barracks. The storm breaks. At 1940 hours, the first shots rang out. The Rangers hit the camp with everything they had. Inside the compound, the air turned into a wall of lead. But at the Kabul River Bridge, the real battle was just beginning. At 1942 hours, the first wave of Japanese soldiers, alerted by the gunfire at the camp, rushed toward the bridge. They didn't use cover, they ran in a massive, disorganized block, confident in their numbers. Pajota waited until the bridge was sagging under the weight of the enemy. Fire! The V formation erupted. 200 rifles and a line of machine guns opened up simultaneously, catching the Japanese in a crossfire that shredded the front ranks instantly. Seconds later, Pajota triggered the demolitions. A massive explosion tore a hole in the center of the bridge. It wasn't enough to drop the span, but it was enough to stop the tanks. A Japanese tank tried to force its way across anyway. It lurched forward, only to nosedive into the hole, its hull wedged tight and blocking the path for any other vehicles. A Filipino guerrilla, who had been taught how to use a bazooka only that morning, stepped out from cover. He took aim and fired. The rocket slammed into the tank's armor, turning the bridge into a furnace of twisted steel. The final stand. For 25 minutes, the Kabul River became a river of fire. The Japanese regrouped and charged again and again, driven by a desperate need to reach the camp. They attempted to flank the position by wading through the river downstream, but Pajota's reserve squads were waiting in the tall grass. The water turned dark with the shadows of those who tried to cross. At 1958 hours, a red flare hissed into the night sky over the prison camp. It was the signal, the prisoners were out. The Rangers were carrying the men who couldn't walk, loading them onto water buffalo carts provided by the local villagers. But Pajota couldn't leave. He knew the Japanese were still functional. If he retreated too soon, the battalion would reorganize and hunt down the slow-moving evacuation column. He held the line for another 7 minutes of suicidal Japanese charges. His machine guns grew so hot the barrels began to glow a dull cherry red. His men poured water from their canteens over the weapons to keep them from seizing. Finally, at 2005 hours, a second flare went up. The evacuation was across the Pampanga River. They were safe. Pajota gave the order to melt back into the jungle. The aftermath of a miracle. The statistics of the engagement at the bridge were staggering. Against 1,000 veteran Japanese soldiers, Pajota's 200 guerrillas had killed an estimated 400 to 500 enemy troops. Pajota lost only 21 men. It was a casualty ratio of nearly 25 to 1, one of the most lopsided defensive victories in the history of the Pacific War. More importantly, the bridge held. Because of Pajota's stand, the Rangers were able to rescue 512 prisoners. Not a single American prisoner was left behind. When the survivors finally reached American lines, some were so overwhelmed they tried to share their meager rations with their rescuers, still unable to believe they were free. Captain Juan Pajota's decision to delay the raid by 24 hours, based on his understanding of Japanese troop movements, had saved the mission from certain disaster. He proved that on the battlefield, the numbers are secondary to the heart of the men holding the line. The raid at Cabanatuan is often remembered as a masterpiece of Ranger tactics, but it was Pajota's bridge of fire that ensured those 512 ghosts of Bataan finally got to go home.